Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Transfigured. This is a solo episode entitled My Message to the Jews. So, about 9 months ago, I had an episode titled Muslim Christian Relations on YouTube and the Future of Liberalism and the Freedom of Religion. And that was primarily interacting with sort of the stabbing of Marmari in various Muslim Christian interactions because of that. Check out that video. I thought it was a good one. Hezi, one of my Jewish friends and a frequent friend of the channel, wrote, looking forward, Sam, will there be a follow episode regarding the Jews? It has been 9 months, but here it is. Sometimes the best things take 9 months to incubate, I guess. So I would first like to say some of my best friends are Jewish. Now, I'm of course saying that as a little bit tongue in cheek. That phrase, some of my best friends are Jewish, is sort of one of those cliches of people who try and make themselves look less racist than they are, or something like that, or as if that's an excuse to say whatever you want. But, it's also kind of true in my case. I grew up in the northern suburbs of Chicago. My area was about 15 to 20% Jewish. I went to Cornell for undergrad, which was also very Jewish, probably even more Jewish than that. My freshman year roommate was Jewish from Long Island. We had an Israeli flag in my dorm. That was fine by me. And in high school, I was sort of like the nerdy social type, where I like to have fun, but not too much fun, and but also like to take hard classes and get good grades some of the time. And that put me, in a social circle with a lot of the Jewish kids in the area. I grew up in a church that was very dispensationalist. If you don't know what that means, dispensationalism is a sort of a method or a hermeneutic for interpreting the Bible and assigning various promises and covenants in the Bible to various people and figuring out what their fulfillments will be. And this sort of eschatological and theological framework often leads people to believe that the current state of Israel and the modern Jewish, diaspora play some role, perhaps a very specific role in coming eschatological events. And my church was very excited about how current events might be signs of the end times. This video isn't really going to be dealing with eschatology directly, or really trying to answer questions along those lines. I'm more just sort of giving a personal background. But I noticed that some dispensationalists, especially those who don't grow up with Jews in real life, tend to have they tend to idolize Jews, or almost view them as like semi supernatural people. It can be kind of strange sometimes, the weird sort of hyper respect that some dispensationalists have for Jews. And I'll just say that having grown up around a lot of Jews, I was prevented from having that sort of opinion. I had a much more realistic and nuanced and humanized view of Jewish people because I had so much interaction with them growing up. But another reason for this video is that there's been, a very clear and real growing trend in anti-Semitism, and you see it sort of on both ends, the both of the extreme ends of the political spectrum. On the left end of the political spectrum, this can often take the form of pro-Gaza, pro-Palestinian protests, like the kinds that have happened on campus, chants from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, things along those lines. But there's also been a noticeable and growing right-wing form of anti-Semitism that you don't tend to see on campus. It mainly shows up on the internet and places like Twitter and stuff like that. And I remember at first, I sort of thought that this was maybe somewhat fake or astroturfed. Maybe some rogue player out there was trying to make it look that way. Maybe they were just trying to make Twitter look bad after Elon Musk took it over, or I don't know. I kind of downplayed it at first, but then it started showing up in people that I knew were real people, or people that I at least highly suspected were real people and not just, say, Russian bots or agents, or at least I think they aren't. And so there really does seem to be a growing trend. And there's, lots of studies that support this. If you look at rates of unfavorable opinions of Jewish people by age, this is from 2024. If you look at like 70 and 80-year-olds, it's in like the single digits of the number of people who have unfavorable opinions of Jews. But it goes up the younger you look. And by the time you get to 20-year-olds, there's almost a 25% unfavorable opinion of Jews, with people who voted for Donald Trump having a slightly more likely unfavorable opinion than those who voted for Kamala Harris, at least among those who are in their 20s. In later generations, there really isn't any political divide between dislike of Jewish people. And I don't know, why would that be? Is it just sort of distance further away from the Holocaust? Older people remember World War II better, and those sorts of things. I'm not exactly sure what to attribute the cause of that to. And if you look at, say, number of anti-Semitic incidents in the U.S., it's been going up year over year very steadily since 2013. And the study I was looking at didn't have full data for 2024 yet, but all the evidence suggested that 2024 had the highest number of anti-Semitic incidences in a very long time in U.S. history. And it especially seems to have peaked after October 7th and the incidents, falling after Gaza's attack on Israel. And, 2025 data isn't out yet either, but I suspect that the trend is only continuing. So this suggests to me it's not just some pretend astroturfed or fake online phenomenon, but there's something very real going on. Another thing that I find highly disturbing is I noticed the increasing use online, especially on Twitter, of people who will use the phrase Christ is king as some sort of kind of like anti-Semitic taunt. I think that the purpose is like, nana nana boo boo, Jesus is in charge and you Jews aren't, like our side won, you guys lost. So, something like that, and sort of kind of reminiscent of, calling Jews Christ killers and, that kind of stuff from a while ago. And there's this conference I noticed being held by Right Response Ministries. I was looking into them. They're very much a Christian nationalist sort of group. And I know the phrase Christian nationalism is extremely fraught, confusing, unspecific. I think Paul Vanderklay is right in that there's a lot of people who are Christian nationalists of some variety or another, even if they don't like that phrase. But there is still a group of people who use that phrase intentionally and self-descriptively, and they tend to seem to want some sort of theocracy, often of some sort of Reformed or Calvinist type. And so this conference seems to be that kind of Reformed Calvinist Christian nationalist, kind of hard Christian right traditionalist sort of thing. But they titled their conference Christ is King. Now, are they intentionally trying to do that anti-Semitic thing like the phrase is used online? Are they trying to like recapture that phrase away from the anti-Semites? Are they being like kind of ambiguous? Are they sort of being like kind of stick it to the man? I'm going to use phrases that you don't like, even if it's a little bit dangerous. I'm not exactly sure what the motivation is, and I don't want to just attribute anti-Semitism to all the people organizing or hosting or speaking at or attending that conference, but I still find it a little bit strange. But anyway, there's the old saying. I remember I've been to the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, and it has this phrase, first they came for, I believe it's a poem, I guess. First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. And then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. So here I am with whatever platform I may have, whatever influence I may have. I don't mean to be too grandiose, but or think that I have more influence than I do, but I am speaking out, I guess. And what I find particularly disturbing is that the rise in anti-Semitism often seems to be in like hardcore Christian online circles, like say Ortho Bros or Rad Trad Catholics and stuff like that. Sort of this very strong Christian identitarian anti-Jewishness. And I find it extremely distasteful. And I'm here to say you should stop and don't do it to whatever extent you listen to me. All right, so I'm going to now spend the rest of the presentation sort of talking about the history of Christianity and Judaism and Unitarianism's role in all of that. So the first passage I'm going to read is from Matthew 15, and this is Jesus's encounter with the Syrophoenician woman. A Canaanite woman from that region came out and was crying, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon." But he did not answer her a word. And his disciples came and begged him, saying, "Send her away, for she is crying out after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." And he answered, "It is not right to take the children's bread and to throw it to the dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "O woman, great is your faith. Be it done for you as you desire." And her daughter was healed instantly. And so, I mean, there's been a lot of talk recently about how, Jesus is always sort of welcoming of the stranger or the foreigner or the ethnic other. And there are certainly instances where you can see that, but there's also this other side of Jesus. You might call this ethnocentric, Jewish focused, Jewish only side of Jesus. And one thing I will say from interacting with lots of Jews, and because some of my friends are Jews, you can still see this side of Judaism that is often very self-focused and self-prioritizing. And this somewhat suspicion of outsiders is certainly stronger in some Jewish people than others, some Jewish communities than others. But when I look at this, I can see that Jesus has that same thing going on. And you could even say that he refers to this Canaanite or this Syrophoenician woman with an ethnic slur. I mean, calling someone a dog, I don't think that was any more polite then than it is now. If anything, the opposite. But still, she doesn't take it as an insult. She sort of leans into it, right? This idea that, well, even the dogs get to eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. She's sort of recognizing this sort of Jewish centricness, this sort of closeness to God that the Jewish people have, and her outsider status to it, but still hoping for some of the crumbs that fall from the master's table. And I think that this is a passage that doesn't get talked about enough when we talk about Jesus's self-understanding and Jesus's interaction with ethnic outsiders. But I'm going to read this other passage, this other parable from Jesus. This is the parable of the wicked tenants. Here, another parable. There was a master of a house who planted a vineyard and put a fence around it and dug a winepress in it and built a tower and leased it to the tenants and went into another country. When the season for fruit drew near, he sent his servants to the tenants to get his fruit. And the tenants took his servants and beat one, killed another, and stoned another. Again, he sent other servants more than the first, and they did the same to them. Finally, he sent his son to them, saying, "They will respect my son." But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and have his inheritance." And they took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. When, therefore, the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to the tenants? They, that is the crowd, said to him, "He will put those wretches to a miserable death and let out the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the fruit in their seasons." Jesus said to them, "Have you never read the scriptures? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore, I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing its fruit. And the one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and when it falls on anyone, it will crush him." When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard this parable, they perceived that he was speaking about them. Although they were seeking to arrest him, they feared the crowds because they held him to be a prophet. And I think that while you can certainly just interpret this parable as specifically targeting the Jewish leadership, and there's even some reason in the context to think that, I think that I do think that the actual interpretation is larger, and that this is something like what you might call supersessionism. I know that is a very loaded word, and it can mean different things to different people in different theological contexts. But I do think that this parable is something like that the Jewish people will be removed from their privileged spot and their spot will be given to someone else as a result of their failing to heed the warnings of the son sent to them by the owner of the vineyard. So even within Jesus, you can see this tension between his Jewish ethnocentrism, or his Jewish first focus, like you saw in the Syrophoenician woman incident, but also this idea, this warning that the Jewish people are playing with fire, so to speak, and not doing what they're supposed to be doing, and that his message is first and foremost to them, but it is I don't know, a dubious message, a message full of warning that what they have is going to be taken to them and given to someone else. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about the Alexandrian Pogroms, which I feel like is an incident in history that not enough people, and especially not enough Christians, know about. So in 38 AD, ethnic tensions in Alexandria were reaching a boiling point. Alexandria had a population, historians estimate, around 500,000 people, and maybe about 25 to 35% of the population there was Jewish. The Greeks held full Alexandrian civic status, while Jews had legal autonomy but were excluded from full citizenship. The Greeks seemed to be resentful of Jewish ascendancy, or sort of improper uppityness, or a lack of heeding their lower caste status. Pogroms then began with sort of looting of Jewish businesses, murders, rapes, house burnings, etc. There were also a series of public humiliations, such as forced pork eating, putting statues of Caligula in synagogues, and even crucifixions. There's almost sort of like it's like when you read the accounts of this, almost like a theatrical delight in putting Jews back in their perceived place or something like that. And the Alexandrian governor, the governor of Egypt, perhaps Flaccus, clearly sided with the Greeks and refused to stop or persecute the violence. And a phrase that I'll repeat a couple times this episode: what you permit, you eventually sanction. And the governor was permitting all of this violence. Philo of Alexandria led a delegation on behalf of the Jews to the emperor. Philo was of noble Jewish stock, and he was perhaps related to the Herodians. He was also a very famous philosopher, and his writings were primarily preserved by Christians because they appreciated his philosophy. And Philo is our primary historical source on these events, and he was living in Alexandria at the time and was a first-person witness. Caligula, the emperor, according to Suetonius, is by this point sort of a raving mad, hedonic, sadistic narcissist. And Philo goes and visits Caligula. Caligula mocks the Jews and is insulted by their refusal to worship himself as a god. A little after this incident, Caligula will even order a statue of himself to be placed in the Jerusalem temple. That never ends up happening, but one can only imagine what would have happened if he had tried, or if he had. Caligula eventually executes Flaccus, the governor, for actually reasons not related to the ethnic riots. In 41 AD, Caligula is assassinated. Claudius replaces Caligula and reaffirms Jewish rights and restores justice, ending the ethnic violence there for now. Although during this period, it's estimated that perhaps thousands of Jews were killed. Jews do seem to have killed some Greeks too, but it looks more like self-defense, or perhaps just defending their turf in the city. The Jews were eventually cornered into sort of an urban ghetto within the city of Alexandria because of this violence. These events are like, if you want to know, like when I'm reading the the book of Acts, when exactly is the period of 38 to 41 AD? And it's basically Acts chapter 9 through 12, which is when Saul becomes Paul and Peter has his visions and visits Cornelius. So that's about the exact same time frame that this ethnic riot or pogrom is happening in Alexandria. And I would like to posit, and I'm not the only person to say this, that it's something like the first act of urban ethnic anti-Semitism in the Western world. And we might not think of Egypt as the Western world now, but Alexandria was certainly part of the Western world in that kind of broader sense back then. And that has a lot of the characteristics of things that you see later, right? This sort of looting of Jewish businesses, pushing the Jews into their own specific corner of a city, ethnic violence, humiliation, all of that, and the desecration of Jewish symbols, and those sorts of things are all present in this event, kind of for the first time in Western history. Now, obviously, the Jews had rough times in other places before, like Persia or their own homeland, or even Egypt prior. But this is like sort of the first time that it's happening in a way that almost seems to kind of foreshadow modern anti-Semitism in a specifically Western context. So I'm going to sort of focus back to the book of Acts. So Acts chapter 18. This is actually a little bit after the Alexandrian pogroms. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Prescilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. And he went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. And he reasoned in the synagogues every Sabbath and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy arrived in Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. And when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." Now, what's interesting is there's that little detail about Claudius. And remember, Claudius is the emperor who replaces Caligula. So Claudius had expelled the Jews from Rome. Most historians believe this happened sometime between 41 and 54 AD. It's actually a little bit unclear. Since the Jews so this is from Suetonius, again, that same historian that describes Caligula as sort of a raving madman. And if you like the rest is history, Suetonius is the historian that writes scandalous biographies of Roman emperors that the Rest is History podcast recently did a series on his works. So he writes, since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he, that is Claudius, expelled them from Rome. And there's debate among historians if Chrestus is actually just Suetonius misunderstanding or mishearing Christus, or whether there actually was a historic person named Chrestus. But most historians do lean in the direction that it's actually supposed to be Christus, and that this is a incident where Christians in Rome are causing a disturbance in the Jewish community, and that Claudius, as a result of these disturbances, kicks all the Jews and presumably the Christians out along with them. And it's easy to imagine that happening, like when you read the book of Acts and other parts of the New Testament. Oftentimes when the Christian communities first arrive, or a Christian missionary like Paul or someone else first arrives in a synagogue, that it can cause a big disturbance, and that disturbance can boil over into civic unrest, and that civic unrest gets the attention of the leaders, and that seems to be most likely what happened. And I'll also point out that it is not the Apostle Paul himself who's doing this. Like, there's sort of this common misperception, I would say, that would make a good episode in and of itself, that like Paul invented Christianity, and like all of Christianity that we know of is downstream from Paul. And while I don't mean to downplay Paul's influence, a lot of the same patterns that you see in Paul are happening in many other places before Paul, or completely apart from Paul's influence. And this disturbance in Rome would be an example. Paul hasn't yet visited Rome. We don't know which Christians these are, if it is in fact Christians, which I think is the most likely scenario, that are causing this disturbance in the Jewish community in Rome. So if other Christian missionaries go and visit a Jewish synagogue or a Jewish community and cause disturbances that get the attention of the local authorities, then that's not a uniquely Pauline thing. This was in Christianity even before Paul is as influential as he is. So anyway, that's another interesting story, and sort of the beginnings of poor Jewish-Christian relations. Although you might say the beginnings of poor Jewish-Christian relations happened during Jesus's own lifetime, and especially his crucifixion, but sort of focusing on the emergence of Christianity and the sort of disturbances that it would cause within the Jewish community. All right, continuing on in the book of Acts. But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal, saying, "This man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law." But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names in your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things." And he drove them from the tribunal. And they all seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to any of this. And it's actually a really interesting historical fact. I learned this from Sean Finnegan recently, that Gallio was only the proconsul of Achaia for a very short time, like late 51 and early 52 AD. And there are inscriptions in Corinth that help date this. And so it's actually one of the things that helps anchor the storyline of the book of Acts in history, so that we can know when these events are taking place even more precisely than just sort of at the level of decades. The way that you can date the events in the book of Acts to the level of years is often anchoring at this point of Gallio being the proconsul of Achaia, and meaning that this event took place in late 51 or 52 AD. And then you can sort of dovetail the other events in the book in Acts before and after that date. But again, you see this civil strife between Jews and Christians at the arrival of Christians. And it's, again, not just Paul, right? Sosthenes is the one getting the brunt of it here. And that there is this, I don't know how else to say it, this propensity to act violently towards the Christians from the Jewish community that is an important part of this story. And they often try and interact with the civil authorities, but the civil authorities sometimes take interest, sometimes don't. But again, you can see this is another example of what you permit, you eventually sanction. All right. So, skipping outside the New Testament for a bit, I'm going to talk about Justin Martyr and his dialogue with Trypho the Jew. This was written in the 150s AD, although the dialogue that it's based on probably took place in the late 130s or early 140s AD. So this is about 100 years after the events in the book of Acts that I was just describing. Justin is a Gentile convert to Christianity. He was a philosopher. He had studied lots of kinds of philosophy before converting to Christianity. And now he's having this dialogue / debate with some non-Christian Jews. And so this is the very beginning of the dialogue. "Hail, O philosopher," said Trypho. Trypho's the Jew. And immediately after saying this, he turned round and walked along with me. His friends likewise followed him. Justin: "But who are you, most excellent man?" Then he told me frankly both his name and his family. "Trypho I am called, and I am a Hebrew of the circumcision, and have escaped from the war lately carried on there, and I am spending my days in Greece, chiefly in Corinth." So what is the war that he's talking about? So we can remember that the temple had been destroyed in 70 AD by Titus in response to Jewish uprisings in Israel. And then later on in 132 AD, Bar Kokhba there was the Bar Kokhba revolt led by a Jew named Simon Bar Kokhba. And this was in response to the construction of a Roman city called Aelia Capitolina on the ruins of Jerusalem, and even the beginnings, I believe, of constructions of a pagan temple to Zeus in the former location of the Jewish temple. And so Simon Bar Kokhba sought to liberate Judea from Roman occupation, retake Jerusalem, and rebuild the temple. And many imagined and hoped that he would be the Messiah. Again, the Jewish hopes for the Messiah often looked like someone like that. It did achieve some initial success in expelling the local Roman control from Jerusalem, but the Romans came back in force in 135 AD, defeated the Jews, and killed Simon and expelled all Jews from Jerusalem and Judea and the surrounding area. And they renamed this surrounding area Palestine in sort of a jest against the Jews. And Palestine was coming from the word Philistine, which was obviously the enemies of the Jews in the Old Testament. And so, when people are shouting from the river of the sea, Palestine will be free, and they're framing the Jews as these occupier colonial forces, these European white colonialists, it should be remembered that the only reason why that area is called Palestine is some European white colonialists came in and took it from the Jews and expelled the Jews and renamed it Palestine as like a joke and an insult. Something that I feel like is a little bit all too quickly forgotten from the historical record. So continuing on in Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho, I declare that those who do not repent before death will not be saved at all. And I likewise declare that those from the seed of Abraham who live according to the law and do not believe in this Christ before the end of life will not be saved. And especially those in the synagogues who have cursed and who curse those believing in this very Christ, so that they may not obtain salvation and may not escape the punishment in the fire. So, what is he referring to about this cursing of Christians in the synagogues? This is part of the Jewish rabbinical liturgy. It's the 12th out of 18 benedictions in the daily prayer. And some historians date this addition to the Jewish liturgy to either the 1st century or the 2nd century. And Justin is actually the first external reference to it. This dialogue is likely written around 135 AD, or written about a conversation 135 AD, as I mentioned. And so the blessing of the heretics, as it's called in the Jewish liturgy, reads like this: For the apostates, let there be no hope, and uproot the kingdom of arrogance speedily and in our days. May the Nazarenes, the Notzrim, which is, code for Christians because they follow Jesus of Nazareth, and the Menim be destroyed in a moment, and let them be blotted out of the book of life and not be inscribed together with the righteous. Blessed are you, O Lord, who humbles the arrogant. So, I mean, this is quite literally a prayer to damn the Christians and to blot them out from the book of life. And this is in the Jewish liturgy, and it was introduced probably sometime in the 1st century, maybe the 2nd century, probably the 1st century. And so when Justin says that you Jews curse us in your synagogues, this is what he's referring to. And so this is, one of the important and interesting elements in Jewish Christian relations and Jewish Christian history. Continuing on a little bit, for you curse in your synagogues all those who have become Christians from that time, and the other nations which are also actively carrying out the curse, but put to death those who merely confess themselves to be Christians. And when neither they nor you are persuaded by us, they strive to make us deny the name of Christ. We choose rather to be put to death and endure, being persuaded that God will repay us with all good things which he has promised through Christ. And then a little further, and besides all these things, we pray for you that you may obtain mercy from Christ. For he taught us to pray even for our enemies, saying, Be kind and merciful, even as your heavenly Father is. For we see the Almighty God is kind and merciful, causing his sun to rise on the ungrateful and the righteous, sending rain on the holy and the wicked, all of whom he has taught that he will also judge. So Justin here is saying that while the Jews curse Christians in their liturgy, the Christians pray for and bless the Jews in their own churches. And then he quotes the, very Matthean sounding, be merciful for your heavenly Father is merciful, pray for those who curse you, etc. And so you can imagine in this early stage when Christianity is still quite small, and while Judaism is itself a persecuted religious minority in the Roman Empire, Christianity is like a minority within a minority that's persecuted by both the Jews and, when the Jews can get it to happen, by the authorities who they have persecute the Christians. But Justin is saying that we don't respond to cursing with cursing, but we respond to cursing with blessing. And so this is an interesting early glimpse. I mean, there's a lot of parts of Justin Martyr that might sound anti-Semitic, taken out of context, but when you look at the broader message in Justin Martyr, it is still this idea that he's longing for the salvation of the Jews and not returning their treatment of the Christians in kind. So I'm going to read a little bit from the Martyrdom of Polycarp. Polycarp was martyred in 155 AD. And there is a work called the Martyrdom of Polycarp, which seems to have been written by an eyewitness very shortly after the events. And it depicts pagans and Jews working and celebrating together as the Bishop of Smyrna is martyred in a public stadium in the city. The Jews even suggest to the Romans to burn his corpse so that there will not be any relics left for the Christians to save. Now, as Polycarp was entering into the stadium, there came to him a voice from heaven saying, "Be strong and show yourself a man, O Polycarp." No one saw who it was that spoke to him, but those of our brethren who were present heard the voice. Heard the voice. All right, moving on. Anyway, this is what one of the officials then later says: "Swear by the fortune of Caesar, repent and say, away with the atheists." But Polycarp, gazing with a stern countenance on all the multitude and the wicked heathen then in the stadium, and waving his hand towards them, while with groans he looked up to heaven, said, "Away with the atheists." Then the proconsul urging him and saying, "Swear, and I will set you at liberty. Reproach Christ." Polycarp declared, 86 years I have served him, and he never did me any injury. How then can I blaspheme my king and savior? So again, you see this, like what Justin Martyr was talking about, how the authorities will ask Christians to, curse and recant Christ, but they would rather die than do that. Continuing, while he spoke these and many other things, he was filled with confidence and joy, and his countenance was full of grace, so that not merely did it not fall as if troubled by these things said to him, but on the contrary, the proconsul was astonished and sent his herald to proclaim in the midst of the stadium thrice, "Polycarp has confessed that he is a Christian." This proclamation having been made by the herald, the whole multitude of both the heathens and Jews who dwelt in Smyrna cried out with uncontrollable fury, and in a loud voice said, "This is the teacher of Asia, the father of the Christians, and the overthrower of our gods. He who has been teaching he has been teaching many not to sacrifice or to worship the gods." The multitudes immediately gathered together wood and kindling out of the shops and baths, the Jews especially, according to custom, eagerly assisting them in it. And when the funeral pile was ready, Polycarp, laying aside all his garments and loosing his girdle, sought also to take off his sandals. And then he, the Roman official, did his utmost that not the least memorial of him should be taken away by us, although many desired to do so, this and to become possessors of his holy flesh. For this end he suggested to go and entreat the governor not to give up his body to be buried, lest, forsaking him that was crucified, they begin to worship this one. This he said at the suggestion and urgent persuasion of the Jews, who also watched us. The centurion then, seeing the strife excited by the Jews, placed the body in the midst of the fire and consumed it. So there are more instances of this sort of behavior than I read. You see it in the book of Acts, you see it in Justin Martyr, you see it in the Martyrdom of Polycarp and other places. This sort of alliance between the Jews and the pagans to persecute Christians, and that the Jews were often quite violent towards the Christians, or at least encouraging of the pagans to be violent towards the Christians. And I don't know. My point here isn't just a simple like, oh, the Jews were mean to the Christians, so it's no surprise that the Christians were mean to them. Although I guess it's a little bit of that. But I don't know. My message isn't that the Christians should repay this early mean behavior of the Jews towards the Christians in kind, but that we should, hope and love and pray for those who persecute us and have persecuted us in the past. But I do think that too many people don't know or misunderstand that part of the, at least, understandable roots of some of the early anti-Jewish feelings in Christian communities was because of the way that the Jews were treating them. And that's an important detail in the story. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit now about sort of the connection between Unitarianism and Judaism and Trinitarian conceptions of Jesus and anti-Jewish feelings, or at least in the case of Justin Martyr, this connection between if you stop viewing Jesus as a human being and start viewing him as God, or at least a God or some sort of divine being come down from heaven, it often de-emphasizes Jesus's Jewishness. And that, I think, part of the motivation for high Christology in the early Christian community was to differentiate Christianity from Judaism and to sort of de-emphasize the Jewishness of Jesus. And so I'm going to cover that in with some quotes and some examples. So this is again from Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho. Trypho said, "For your assertion that this Christ pre-existed as a god before the ages and then submitted to be born, having become a man, and that he is not a man of men, seems to me not only paradoxical, but even foolish." Justin: "And I replied to these things, I know that the statement seems paradoxical, and especially to those of your race, who have never desired either to understand or to do the things of God, but only the things of your teachers, as God himself cries out." That's a reference to Isaiah 29:13. "However, Trypho, I have already said the fact that this man is the Christ of God is not disproven if I am unable to prove that he pre-existed as son of the creator of all things, being a God, and has been born a man through the Virgin. But if it is proved by all means that this Christ is of God, that this is the Christ of God, whoever he may be, but if I do not prove that he preexisted and endured being born a man of like passion with us, having flesh according to the Father's will, it is only right to say that I have been mistaken in this, but not to deny that this is the Christ. If he appears to have been born a man of men, and it is proven that he became Christ by selection. For indeed there are some, my friends of your race, who acknowledge him to be the Christ, but maintain that he became a man from men, with whom I do not agree, nor would I, even if very many who held the same opinion as me were to say so, since we have been commanded by Christ himself not to be persuaded by human teachings, but by those teachings proclaimed through the blessed prophets and taught by him." So what's going on in that quote is that Justin Martyr is trying to argue from the scriptures to Trypho that Jesus pre-existed as like a secondary divine God figure prior to becoming man. And Trypho's like, the Jews never expect the Messiah to be a God come down from heaven, but expect him to be a man from men, a son of David, a son of man. And Justin Martyr is saying, well, look, even if I can't prove the divine pre-existence and incarnation bit, at least don't take that as arguments against him being the Messiah, for there are other arguments that he is the Messiah. And I know some Jewish Christians who do not believe in the pre-existence of Jesus, but still believe that he is the Christ of God. And he calls them my friends. And he says that he uses multiple pronouns that sort of connect himself with them, and that they are of the same opinion as Justin Martyr in believing that they are Christians and that Jesus is the Christ. But he disagrees with them about preexistence and the divinity of Jesus, although don't misunderstand Justin Martyr's understanding of the divinity of Jesus for the later Trinitarian one. It's actually quite different. But what's interesting is Justin Martyr has the ability to call other Christians heretics. In the same dialogue, he'll say that Gnostics are evil heretics and false Christians, and you should not think of them as Christians. He'll even say that Christians who do not believe in a literal premillennial return of Jesus and a millennial kingdom are not, in fact, Christians and are heretics. So that premillennialism was for him a red line in the sand that marked a true Christian from a false Christian. But with regards to the pre-existence of Jesus, he doesn't treat that topic that way. He seems to say that you can disagree about that and still be friends and Christians together, which is interesting. I argued with Father Stephen DeYoung recently that I would appreciate if the pre-existence Christians returned to the Justin Martyr treatment for us non-pre-existent believing Christians. But what's interesting is that you can see that there is this distinction kind of already in the Christian community, that it's more of a Gentile thing to think that Jesus pre-existed as a God and came down, and it's more of a Jewish thing to think that Jesus began to exist as a man and was purely a man and had a human origin and a human only Christology. And that in other places, Justin seemingly connects this with a Jewish propensity to not be quite as good of a Christian as Greek converts tend to make. But yet he's still relatively amicable about this. And I do think that it is true. Oh, wait a minute. I forgot one more paragraph. A response from Trypho. I'll say what Trypho said. To me, indeed, they seem to speak more persuasively than you. Those who say that he became a man and was anointed by selection and became the Christ, than those who say those things that you say. I think that translation is not quite right. For indeed, all of us expect the Christ to be born a man from men, and Elijah to anoint him when he comes. But if this man appears to be the Christ, he must indeed be a man from men. So Trypho is saying that the Jewish expectation is that the Messiah would be a man from men. And I do think that part of the appeal of high Christology or logos Christology or incarnation Christology was the idea that Jesus was not really essentially Jewish, that the Jewish part of him was sort of accidental or only taken on during the incarnation, and that really he's actually the logos of God or a second God or the second member of the Trinity later on. And that this sort of de-emphasizes his humanness and his Jewishness at the same time and sort of disconnects it from this Jewish understanding of a Messiah. And I do think that that is part of the motivation of that is somewhat of an anti-Jewish feeling or a desire to separate themselves from the Jews or make the religion more palatable to Greek sensibilities and not feel like you're accepting a Jewish man as your leader and your ruler and your lord, but you're accepting, this divine figure who was maybe sort of Jewish for a while, but that's not really who he is or something like that. All right, Constantine at the Council of Nicaea and the dating of Easter. When the question relative to the sacred festival of Easter arose, it was universally thought that it would be convenient that all should keep the feast on one day. For what could be more beautiful and more desirable than to see this festival through which we receive the hope of immortality celebrated all with one accord and in the same manner? It was declared to be particularly unworthy for this, the holiest of all festivals, to follow the calculation of the Jews, who had soiled their hands with the most fearful of crimes, and whose minds were blinded. We ought not, therefore, to have anything in common with the Jews, for when the Savior has shown us another way, and consequently we desire, dearest brethren, to separate ourselves from the detestable company of the Jews. So this is Constantine speaking at the Council of Nicaea about when to date Easter. Paul Vanderklay has been talking a lot about Easter datings, and this is probably the most important Easter dating paragraph in all of Christian history. And you can see, while Justin Martyr has some anti-Jewish sentiments, and I would certainly agree with that, he still has some, nice treatment towards the Jews and wants to treat them as sort of an enemy that is loved. Things start to feel a little bit different now by the Council of Nicaea when Christianity is bigger than Judaism, as opposed to Judaism being bigger than Christianity. And Christianity now has the force of the emperor behind it, as opposed to the force of the emperor pointed at it. And so when Constantine is saying things like the detestable Jews, and we want to separate ourselves from the company of the Jews, and the Jews are unworthy and, cursed by God, or what does he say, cursed by God, soiled their hands with the most fearful of crimes and whose minds are blinded, those sorts of things, it starts to take on a slightly different and more worrisome tone for the Jews, I'll say. But Constantine himself, as far as I'm aware, didn't do any violence against the Jews. And honestly, I told Jacob this the other night, that one thing I find a little bit confusing about Constantine is Constantine loved monotheism. Even before he was a Christian, he was sort of a pagan monotheist who believed in sort of this like Neoplatonic mystery religion that thought that there was only one God above all things, and that all basic religions that were true shared the same monotheistic idea, and that humankind had sort of fallen into polytheism and idol worship, and that this was because of confusion and many different names for God, but that a return to the original monotheism of humankind would give great benefit to humankind and unity to humankind and unity to the empire. So he loves monotheism and really has this strong sense that if you worship in a monotheistic fashion, that it will incur divine favor and gifts from heaven and God and help unify people. it's a little bit strange to me that he also has this strong anti-Jewish feeling, because what people more than any other people were responsible for the perseverance and spread of monotheism besides Jews? So I always found that to be a slightly confusing juxtaposition in Constantine, if I'm honest. All right, so moving on to Athanasius. And again, the point of these quotes from Athanasius is this connection of a human Christology. There were still Christians in Athanasius's day who believed that Jesus was a man for men, basically had a biblical Unitarian understanding of Jesus and God, and that Athanasius will criticize these Christians, and he'll often connect their beliefs to Judaism. And so these two quotes are showing this, and this is from a work of Athanasius called De Decretis, or On the Decree, and it's from 350 AD. All right, first quote. For by this offering the Father made all things, and extended his province unto all things. By him he exercises his love to man, and thus he and the Father are one, as has been said. Unless indeed these perverse men make a fresh attempt, and say that the essence of the Word is not the same as the light which is in him from the Father, as if the light in the Son were one with the Father, but he himself foreign in essence as being a creature. Yet this is simply the belief of Caiaphas and the Samosata, which the church cast out. So what's going on here? Athanasius is criticizing Arians for separating, the nature of the Father and the Son, and separating the light that's from the Father and the light that's from the Son, whereas Athanasius argues that the Son is of the same essence and has the same light and same glory as the Father. And he's saying that the Arians who are who are making these distinctions are similar to Caiaphas, a Jewish leader, obviously from the New Testament, and the Samosata. Samosata refers to Paul of Samosata. Paul of Samosata was a biblical Unitarian bishop of Antioch from like 260 to 272 AD, if I remember those dates correctly. And he taught a biblical Unitarian Christology, that Jesus was a human and that he was a man of men who gets exalted to, divine status after his ascension. And so Athanasius is trying to smear the Arians who still believe, people don't know this, the Arians still thought that Jesus was a pre-existent divine figure who came down and went back up. He just wasn't quite as divine as God the Father, very similar to what Justin Martyr thought. And so Athanasius is trying to smear the Arians with being too similar to Jews and to biblical Unitarians. And again, you see this association of biblical Unitarian Christology with Jewish theology, and that this is an icky bad thing, that if you were to get labeled with association with those ideas, that you'd be a heretic and you would be wrong. Another paragraph makes a very similar thing. With such ideas, however, it's no wonder that they, which is the Arians, imagine that of such a son, God was not always Father, and such a son was not always in being, but was generated from nothing as a creature. For such a one is other than the true Son of God. But to persist in such a teaching does not consist with piety, but it is rather the tone of thought of Sadducees and the Samosata. Again, he's trying to smear the Arians with this connection to Jewish ideas and to biblical Unitarian ideas with the name of Paul of Samosata. All right, and that's not the only place where this happens. So this is from the Council of Sirmium in 351 AD. This is actually shortly after that quote from Athanasius that I was reading. This is actually an Arian council. So while Athanasius is trying to smear the Arians with this association with Judaism and biblical Unitarian ideas, the Arians also did not like the biblical Unitarians. I often get confused for an Arian. I'm like, oh my goodness, if you only knew anything about Christian history, you wouldn't make that mistake. But anyway, so this is from the Council of Sirmium, which people don't know was one of the largest councils in the 4th century and was convened by the Emperor Constantius II, who was Constantine's son. So why doesn't this count as a real church council in church history? Well, I guess because it was Arian. So that always brings up the question, are councils correct because they're councils, or are councils correct because they come to the correct conclusion. But if they're only correct because they come to the correct conclusion, why do you need a council in the first place? Is the Council of Nicaea authoritative and therefore its conclusions are authoritative? Or is it only authoritative because it already came to the preordained correct conclusion? I feel like that's a chicken and egg authority question that people have, and that these robber councils, as they're sometimes called, these Arian councils from the middle of the 4th century, sort of beg that question. But anyway, this council was convened by a biblical Unitarian bishop called Photinus of Galatia, who was the bishop of Sirmium. Sirmium was a imperial fortress in modern day Serbia, kind of halfway between the East and the West, which was why the council was called there, was trying to unite East and West in a single theology, in sort of a moderate Arian theology, you could sort of say. But it was convened by a bishop who was a biblical Unitarian who did not believe that Jesus pre-existed the way that Arians do, and that he was the bishop of the city where it was convened, but he was excommunicated at this council for having the same theology as Paul of Samosata. And some of the anathemas are very interesting because you can hear what Photinus of Galatia's theology was in the anathemas from this council, and this is one of them. Whoever explains, I, God the first, and I the last, and besides me there is no God, which is Isaiah 44:6, which is said for the denial of idols and of gods that are not, to the denial of the only begotten before ages God, as Jews do, be he anathema. Basically, anyone who uses as a proof text that God is only one person and that there's only one God, he who uses that text, Isaiah 44:6, to deny that the Son of God is in fact God, as the Jews do, be he anathema. And again, you're getting this connection between biblical Unitarian Christology and Jewish theology, and that biblical Unitarian Christology is obviously wrong because it's too Jewish. And you can see that at the Council of 351 in Sirmium, which again was not actually a Trinitarian council, but an Arian council. All right, you can see something similar in Gregory of Nyssa. I'm still working through Gregory of Nyssa right now with Hank. We've got more Church Fathers episodes about Gregory of Nyssa coming up. So Gregory of Nyssa is on the top of my mind. This is from his Great Catechism, Part 1, which is on the Trinity, paragraph 3. This was written about 385 AD. One who severely studies the depths of the mystery receives secretly in his spirit a moderate amount of apprehension of the doctrine of God's nature, yet he is unable to explain clearly in words the ineffable depth of this mystery. But when you have gained the conception of what the distinction is in these, the oneness again of the nature admits not division, so that the supremacy of the one first cause is not split and cut up into differing godships, neither does the statement harmonize with the Jewish dogma, but the truth passes in the mean between these two conceptions, destroying each heresy and yet accepting what is useful to it from each. The Jewish dogma is destroyed by the acceptance of the word and by their belief in the Spirit, and by belief in the Spirit, not their belief in the Spirit, excuse me, while the polytheistic error of the Greek school is made to vanish by the unity of the nature, abrogating this imagination of plurality. While yet again on the Jewish conception, let the unity of the nature stand, but on the Hellenistic, only the distinction as to persons. So basically, what Gregory of Nyssa is saying here is that Trinitarianism is the mean between the extremes of Judaism, which is only about oneness, and paganism, which is all about plurality, and that the Trinity has both oneness and plurality, and it's the mean between these extremes. But again, you can see that the Jewish conception of God is degraded, but didn't the Christians get their conception of God from Judaism? Did not Jesus affirm the unity of God when he recited the Shema? It's very strange. So again, this idea from the Trinitarian conception of God that the Jewish conception of God is inferior or insufficient, and that the Trinitarian conception is superior because it's halfway to paganism. All right. Ambrose, who was the bishop of Milan, before coming a bishop, he was a high-ranking imperial official. He was a relatively new Christian when it was decided that he would become a bishop. He was baptized and ordained in a almost unprecedentedly short time. He was Bishop of Milan from 374 to 397 AD. Milan was a major city in Italy at that time, overshadowing even Rome. He was a staunch Trinitarian and a fierce enemy of Arianism and quote-unquote heresy. Many historians think that he was the real mastermind and impetus behind the Edict of Thessalonica in 380 AD, issued by Theodosius, which banned non-Trinitarianism in the empire with the threat of violence. I'll get to that later. And his sermons and speaking helped convert Augustine of Hippo. So this is an incident that happened in 388 AD. A report was made by the military count of the East that a synagogue had been burnt, and that this was done by the authority of the bishop. You, the emperor, this is Bishop Ambrose writing to Emperor Theodosius, you, the emperor, gave command that the perpetrator should be punished and the synagogue be rebuilt by the bishop himself. But let it granted that no one will enforce this command upon the bishop, for I have requested your clemency. What if others, more timid because they shrink from death, offer that the synagogue be rebuilt at their cost, or that the count, having found this previously determined, himself orders it to be rebuilt out of the funds of the Christians? Shall the Jews write this inscription on the front of their synagogue? The temple of impiety, erected from the plunder of the Christians. Perhaps the cause of discipline under the law moves you, O emperor. Which then is of greater importance, the show of legal discipline or the cause of religion? It is needful that the legal censure should yield to religion. There is then no adequate cause for such a commotion, that the people should be punished so severely for the burning of a building, and much less since it is the burning of a synagogue, a home of unbelief, a house of impiety, a receptacle of folly which God himself has condemned. And certainly, if I were pleading according to the law of nations, I could tell how many of the church's basilicas the Jews burnt in the time of Emperor Julian. Emperor Julian was alive a couple decades earlier. He's called Julian the Apostate. He was like the grandnephew, I think, or nephew of Constantine, who became emperor. And he surprised everyone by admitting that he was not, in fact, a Christian, but had been a secret pagan this whole time. And he was going to make Rome pagan again and make Rome great again by reinstituting the old gods. But he was only emperor for a couple years. So what Ambrose is saying is that during the brief reign of Julian the Apostate, Jews took that opportunity to burn Christian basilicas. Two at Damascus, one of which is scarcely now repaired, and this at the cost of the church, not of the synagogue. The other basilica still is in rough mass of shapeless ruins. Basilicas were burnt in Gaza, Ascalon, Beirut, and in almost every place in those parts, and no one demanded punishment. And at Alexandria, a basilica which alone surpassed all the rest was burnt by the pagans and the Jews. The church was not avenged. So, shall the synagogue be so? So, I mean, it's pretty clear what he's arguing. He's arguing that religion needs to be held above the law, and basically Christianity is more important than the rule of law. And that part of the reason why the Christians shouldn't repay the Jews for the burning of their synagogue is because the Jews had burned a bunch of Christian basilicas in the decades prior. But again, this brings me to that sentence: what you permit, you eventually sanction. All right. There are a lot of things that Emperor Theodosius did, which people think Constantine did. Emperor Theodosius was emperor from 380 through the 390s or into the 400s. I can't exactly remember. People think that Constantine made Christianity the official religion of Rome, but Constantine only gave it toleration and financial support similar to other religions. It was Theodosius who made Christianity the official religion of Rome. He made people think Constantine made the Trinity the official dogma of Christianity. Constantine specifically calls the Father the only true God, and Jesus a second God subordinate to the first God at the Council of Nicaea. Constantine nor anyone else at the Council of Nicaea was not a Trinitarian. It was Theodosius in 380 and 381 AD that made the Trinity the official dogma of Christianity. People think that Constantine issued the creed that they still read in their churches when they read the Nicene Creed. They think it's coming from the Council of Nicaea. It's actually coming from the Council of Constantinople in 381 AD, which was convened by the Emperor Theodosius. So the creed that churches still read is not actually from Constantine, it is from Theodosius. People think that Constantine outlawed paganism. That's not true. Theodosius did, though. Constantine even built and repaired some pagan temples and had a somewhat strange penchant for depicting himself as the sun god or a pagan god, even in his lifetime after he had supposedly converted to Christianity. So Constantine did not outlaw paganism, Theodosius did. People think that Constantine outlawed other heretical forms of Christianity. And while Constantine did excommunicate Arius at the Council of Nicaea, Constantine worked hard to get Arius readmitted to communion after the Council of Nicaea, even bringing Arius with him to church. People don't know that either. All right, but Theodosius did outlaw heretical Christian groups, and heretical Christian groups were seem to have been tolerated about as well as the Jewish synagogues. I'll just put it that way. People think that Constantine persecuted the Jews. There's no real evidence, as I mentioned earlier. But Theodosius, you can tell that his initial instinct was to protect the Jews and restore the rule of law and stuff like that, and make the churches repay the synagogue for having burned down their synagogue. But because of the intervention of Bishop Ambrose, he did not do that. And so eventually Jewish persecution began to increase and increase. What you permit, you eventually sanction. All right, this is the Edict of Thessalonica, issued in 380 AD by the Emperor Theodosius. According to the apostolic teaching and the doctrine of the gospel, let us believe in the one deity of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, in equal majesty and in a holy Trinity. We order the followers of this law to embrace the name of Catholic Christians. But as for the others, since in our judgment they are foolish madmen, we decree that they shall be branded with the ignominious name of heretics, and shall not presume to give to their conventicles the name of churches. They will suffer in the first place the chastisement of the divine condemnation, and in the second the punishment of our authority, which in accordance with the will of heaven we shall decide to inflict. And inflict it he did. So people sometimes wonder, how in the world is it that Trinitarianism came to dominate all forms of Christianity? And during this kind of special period from 380 AD to 431 AD, all of Christianity was in fact united under the Roman emperor, and all heretical groups were persecuted out of existence, or at least underground or out of the borders of the empire. And Trinitarianism became required for all clergy and for all emperors. Previously, emperors had sort of flipped back and forth from Arian to Nicene, but after Theodosius, there's no more flipping back and forth. All the emperors are Trinitarian. In 399 to 420 AD, the Persian Empire invites the Roman officials and church clergy to harmonize and organize the Assyrian church's clergy and structure. And this is sort of when Trinitarianism gets imported into, at least, I mean, it had been present there before, but I don't think everyone in the Persian Empire was a Trinitarian. I think many, in fact, weren't, like Afrahat the Sage. And that this importation of the Roman clergy and the Roman hierarchy into the Persian or Assyrian church happens between 399 and 420 AD, kind of further cementing Trinitarianism's hold over all of Christendom, even the largest church outside the Roman Empire. By 420 AD, all major churches, both within and outside the Roman Empire, were officially Trinitarian and loyal to the Roman Church. The Western Church, the Eastern Church, the Coptic Church, the Ethiopian Church, the Armenian Church, and the Assyrian Church. The only exception is that there were still some remnants of Arian churches in Germanic pagan land, or they weren't pagan, in Germanic lands. The Goths had been converted to Arian Christianity, and so there was still some Arian Goths that were not Trinitarian up in Germany, but they eventually get distinguished. But all the major branches of Christianity that still exist today were consolidated under the Roman Empire in this period, and there was a heavy military official enforced, and I mean enforced with force, rule that all had to be Trinitarian, and it had that effect. But even though the Trinity consolidated all the churches between 380 and 431 AD, what happens is that there erupts a bunch of Christological controversies. Christological controversies are controversies about how is Jesus both divine and human. First, at the Council of Ephesus in 431, which is a complete basket case of a council if you ever read about it, like it's almost hard to even describe, they excommunicate Nestorius, the bishop of Constantinople. He was excommunicated for being perceived to have too strong of a distinction between the divine and human natures of Christ. He flees to Assyria, and a bunch of his friends flee to Assyria, and the Assyrian church breaks off communion with Rome, and that's still in effect and still why they're called Nestorian. But Nestorians are still Trinitarians. People forget that. 451 AD, the Council of Chalcedon, the Monophysites get excommunicated for having too little distinction between the divine and human natures of Christ. And the Egyptian, Ethiopian, and Armenian churches leave communion with the other churches, and that is still in effect. And by 1054, the Great Schism happens, separating the East from the West. Although, like, honestly, it's not like that happened all at once. That had been a long time coming, and in many ways, they had been sort of practically apart for a long time. All right. In 538 AD, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian bans Jews from reciting the Shema due to its anti-Trinitarianism. Justin was a major legal reformer, and his code still undergirds a lot of European legal systems to this day. The Jews under the Justinian law code were in a status of Servetus Judaeorum, or servitude of the Jews. So they were basically second-class citizens in the Byzantine Empire. And like I said, they get banned from being able to recite the Shema, which is like so ironic. From Mark 12:29, one of the scribes asked Jesus, "What commandment is the most important of all?" Jesus answered, "The most important is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." So Jesus recites the Shema as the most important commandment. To me, this is like the sort of peak example of Trinitarian hypocrisy and irony when it comes to their treatment of the Jews and Jewish monotheism. Fun fact, when Calvin burned Servetus at the stake for non-Trinitarianism, he cited the Justinian law code as precedent and authority to do so. So what happens to the Jews next? Well, as sort of things descend into the Dark Ages, and yes, Tripp, it was a Dark Ages, the Western Jews are sort of now living in Christendom defined by Trinitarianism, which views their understanding of God, and not just Jesus, as deficient. The Roman Empire begins to fall apart, especially in the West, and descend into the Dark Ages. The Eastern Byzantine Empire consolidates and mostly shrinks, and Islam begins conquering many parts of the world previously controlled by Christians, like in the Middle East, North Africa, and Turkey. All right, so this is a little bit of a pivot in subjects, but I find this subject really interesting too. So genetic research, this is sort of answering the question of what happened to the Jews during the Dark and Middle Ages. Genetic research on modern European, that is Ashkenazi Jews, have revealed that there was a severe population bottleneck around the year 1400 AD. The research suggests that all modern Ashkenazi Jews, of which there are about 10 million, descend from a population of about 350 individuals who lived between 1200 and 400 AD. This doesn't mean that the total population was only 350, but rather that the living reproductively active population was that size. The research also suggested that there was a bottleneck further in the past around the year 75 AD. What happened around that time that might have caused a population bottleneck of the Jews? The causes of the bottleneck in the Middle Ages are likely a series of pogroms, forced deconversions, and also outbreaks of the plague in Central Europe at that time. It was also the Little Ice Age during that period of time. It was actually a very rough time in Europe: famines, disease, wars, anti-Semitism, etc. And the Jews aren't entirely unique. Like, for reference, Iceland's effective population bottleneck is estimated to have gone as low as a few thousand, although that's still not quite as low as the Jewish population. And Jewish populations in other regions, such as Spain or the Middle East, were not quite as bottlenecked as the Ashkenazi Jews were. And so, I mean, does this mean that the Jews are inbred? That would be a very mean and uncharitable way to say it. But there are a lot of genetic diseases in the Ashkenazi Jewish population that are relatively unique to that population. And they do have a higher rate of genetic diseases because of their very small population size for this couple 100-year period. I will circle back to this idea in a second, but I suppose I'm bringing it up, like, oh man, just to be even weirder. I do think that part of the reason why Jews are often hated and one of the causes of anti-Semitism is often because Jews tend to be very disproportionately successful and advanced in high-end careers and intellectual endeavors. And one might wonder why it is that the Jews are so, I don't know, intellectually precocious. And one could imagine that if among this population of 350 living adults during the Middle Ages, if it was disproportionately smart, intelligent, high achieving rabbis and their families that stayed loyal to the Jewish faith during this time, that had a extremely large and disproportionate effect on the IQ and the genetics of intelligence on the Jewish populations ever thereafter. And again, I mean that as a compliment. I'm not trying, I know this is a very dicey, weird subject, but I still think it sort of needs to be said. So next, I'm going to sort of transition to the Reformation period and talk about Unitarian attitudes towards Judaism. So, Michael Servetus, no Transfigured video would be complete without talking about Michael Servetus. He was born in 1511, died in 1553, born in Spain, died by fire in Geneva, Switzerland. Servetus was relatively unique in almost, I mean this, in almost all of Christian history before him. Christianity had assumed that, having a Jewish style theology was a bad thing, like many of those quotes that I had showed before. But Michael Servetus really wanted to restore original Christianity and get back to the original truths of Christianity. He was sort of, I would say, in many ways, taking the Protestant Reformation to many of its logical conclusions. And so part of that for him was that we should get a better understanding of Jewish sources and Jewish philosophy and ideas at the time of Jesus, and that Jewish commentators, even relatively late ones like Maimonides, would be really helpful for helping to understand the Old Testament. And that this was an extremely unique idea among Christians for over a millennium, that the Jews would have something positive to teach a Christian about God and even the origins of Christianity. Even though this idea is something that modern scholarship takes for granted, and many Christians today take for granted, is that in order to understand the New Testament, you have to understand in its Jewish context. Michael Servetus was in many ways the first person to have that idea, and he deserves more credit for that than he gets. Almost all Christians prior had negative views of Jewish influence, and Jewish influence on your theology was bad by definition. Servetus really admired Philo of Alexandria, right? I already mentioned Philo of Alexandria earlier. He was a first century Jewish philosopher, and then Servetus viewed Philo as basically sort of an original example of Jewish philosophy contemporary with early Christianity. And so if you're trying to reboot Christianity and Christian theology and Christian philosophy, one should look to him as a very relevant example. And he thought that Servetus thought that getting rid of the Trinity would help Christianity evangelize Jews and Muslims more effectively. Servetus was the first Christian thinker in modern times who proclaimed in clear terms the right of every individual to follow his own conscience and express his own convictions. He was the first to express an idea that it was a crime to persecute and kill for ideas. And obviously, he did that before he himself was killed for his own ideas. But the freedom of conscience and the freedom of religion and the freedom of religious thought and intellectual exploration really begins. I think that you can see some examples in classical era times. Even Constantine says similar things. But the first Christian to say this in a very long time was Michael Servetus. So this is a quote from Marion Hillar, a Servetian scholar. Servetus's legacy was first spread by the Italian humanists and reformers Francesco Stancaro, Giorgio Biantrace, and Gianpiero Alciati, Valentino Gentile, Bernardino Ochino, and Lilio and Fausto Sozzini. Sorry, forgive my Italian. In Poland and in Transylvania, and led to the development of the anti-Trinitarian or Unitarian movement represented by the Unitarians of Transylvania and the Socinians of Poland. In Poland, they were known as the Minor Church or the Polish Brethren. After their expulsion from Poland, they developed into the Unitarian movement in England and America. Socinians were the first who demanded and fully understood the moral imperative and of the complete separation of church and state. They published numerous treatises in Poland and in Holland and defended their rights against the machinations of Jesuits, who eventually succeeded in the destruction of the Reformation in Poland. So another thing that people really don't know enough about in terms of historically important stuff is the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. If you really want to impress people at your next cocktail party, you should talk to them about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It was established in 1569, and it had the greatest degree of religious freedom in Europe at the time, likely due to its religious diversity. There were Catholics, Orthodox, Protestants, Jews, and Muslims all living in that area relatively uniquely. And it also had a relatively decentralized political structure with a powerful noble class that was very spread out and numerous, but not really like a central monarch. In the 1560s, this attracted prominent Unitarians seeking shelter, such as the Venetian Unitarians. Unitarianism was briefly very popular and influential in Venice before it was kicked out. And the Sozzini family, who Socinianism comes from the Sozzini family, and they were prominent northern Italian Unitarians who fled to Poland seeking religious shelter. These Unitarians were disproportionately well educated, philosophically sophisticated, and intellectually influential. So you can imagine Poland getting this sort of strong dose of intellectuals, of Unitarians fleeing Italy and France and Geneva and other places and moving to Poland. And it's sort of like this influx of highly educated, highly intellectual sort of people who sort of quickly rose to positions of prominence. They advocated for religion based off of reason and voluntary membership. The Warsaw Confederation, which is sort of like their constitution, of 1573 saw the establishment of a bicameral legislature with higher and lower voting bodies, the freedom of religion, and a separation of church and state. The monarch wasn't a hereditary monarch, he was elected by the representatives and not inherited. The term commonwealth was used for a sense of common ownership as opposed to the term kingdom. What other country has a government with a bicameral legislature, freedom of religion, freedom of separation of church and state, a constitution, an elected leader, and doesn't view itself as a kingdom? There's some other country that meets all of those things. Where might those ideas have eventually led to? Very interesting to think about. This freedom of religion caused the Jewish population to flourish, as well as many Jews from elsewhere migrated to the region. During this period, perhaps as many as 80% of the Jews in the entire world lived in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. For many centuries afterwards, Poland had the highest concentration of Jews anywhere in Europe. The Jews actually seemed to outnumber the Unitarian Christians by quite a bit. In 1764, approximately 750,000 of the world's total 1.2 million Jews still lived in Poland. That's 62.5%. And we know that Poland had the largest Jewish population, and well, until we know what happens later on. But wait a minute. How did the Jewish population go from 3 to 400 reproductive adults in the years between 12 to 1400 AD to 750,000 Jews in Poland in 1768. All right, so I did some math for you. I'm going to say, let's assume there's 350 Jewish adults in 1350 AD. So that is a 1.64% annual growth rate. Okay, that's actually not as astounding as you might think. But still, how can you sustain a 1.64% annual growth rate in humans? There was something like a 40 to 50% infant and child mortality during this period of the Middle Ages. And there was about a 2% maternal mortality risk. So I'm like factoring these things into my model. And I did the statistics for you. And this comes out to, depending on your assumptions, about 6 to 8 children per mother per lifetime on average. So that's not an impossible thing to imagine, but it's still amazing to sustain that as your average for that long a period of time. That also means half of Jewish mothers had more than 6 to 8 children, while half might have had less. And so to go from 300-ish adults to 750,000 population in just a few hundred years, talk about pronatalism. And I would also point out that, kind of thinking of my interaction with Malcolm Collins, that if you have a religious group who is able to sustain a high birth rate, even for a couple hundred years, and nowadays you wouldn't need to have 6 to 8 children to sustain that high of population growth, because I'm factoring in a high infant mortality rate and a high maternal mortality rate. If you have modern day infant mortality and modern day maternal mortality, you might only need to have, say, 3 to 5 or 3 to 4 or average children per mother per lifetime. And if you sustain that for a couple hundred years, you can go from a couple hundred people to hundreds of thousands of people, almost 1 million people. It's amazing how human populations can grow and shrink over the ages with just a little bit of persistence. What happened to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth might be a burning question at the top of your head right now. Well, obviously, it was the Klausmalinstiski, Kamelnistiski uprising that started a series of civil wars in the Commonwealth around the year 1648 to 1650. This weakened the Commonwealth and led to a series of invasions from Russia, Sweden, Germany, and Transylvania. Basically, it was getting gobbled up from all sides. And there was a resurgence of Catholic identity that led to a Reconquista, or a counter-reformation, that saw Catholicism regain its previous status. Many of these Catholics viewed the Unitarians as untrustworthy elites. Most Unitarians were pacifists, which was understandably not very encouraging if your leaders are pacifist when you're being invaded on all sides. And the Catholics feared the Unitarians might betray them to the Protestant Swedes, so Unitarians were officially forced to flee or convert in 1658. And the previous atmosphere of religious toleration began to disappear, although the Jews seem to have not been targeted by religious persecution by the Catholics, at least at that time. They were probably too numerous at that point to be subject to too much persecution. And I don't think the Jews had as many positions of power as the Unitarians did. All right, so many of the Unitarians fled to Amsterdam, another refuge for religious tolerance, and some secretly fled to England. There were key figures such as Andrzej Wyzałatty and Samuel Przybyszewski, and some translations of various Socinian works began being made into English and Dutch. John Locke was in exile from England and living in the Netherlands during the period of 1683 to 1689. He came in contact with Socinian refugees from Poland, and his private library was full of many Socinian works. Locke writes many of his most famous works during this period of his Dutch exile. He wrote a letter concerning toleration in 1689, which argued for religious toleration for all, including Jews. He wrote 2 treatises of government and the reasonableness of Christianity during that time. And while Locke never publicly declared his Unitarianism, it would have been literally fatal for him to do so because of blasphemy laws in England at the time. And what he didn't say in his theological writings makes it pretty clear he was, in fact, a Unitarian. Almost all historians agree that he likely privately held to Unitarian and Socinian convictions. For him, his political philosophy and his religious philosophy contributed together for a push towards religious toleration. The key and obvious influence connecting his religious ideas and his political ideas was his exposure to Polish Socinian refugees, which greatly impacted his theology and his political philosophy. Isaac Newton and John Milton were also in the same sort of cultural milieu and were sort of private examples of Unitarian Christians in England at that time. This is what Marian Hillar has to say about that time. Moral, social, and political doctrines of the Socinians and Polish brethren eventually led to the development of the Enlightenment. Their ideas were perfected, extended, and popularized by writings of philosophers John Locke, Benedict Spinoza, Pierre Bayle, Voltaire, and David Hume. The arguments used by John Locke in his famous Four Letters for Toleration, published in Holland between 1683 and 1689, coincide with those used by the Polish philosophers. Locke possessed in his library a complete set of Socinian works and certainly read them. He presented a detailed analysis of toleration and church and state relations from a political point of view, obviously suitable for the circumstances in England. So many of Locke's ideas were not actually unique to Locke. He was basically copying and pasting them from the Polish Socinians who had escaped. So Joseph Priestley is another important figure in this whole story. Priestley was a famous scientist, especially in chemistry. He discovered oxygen and many other gases. He's one of the most famous chemists of all time. He became a Unitarian in the 1760s. He developed what I would say a highly unique materialistic and deterministic metaphysics combined with Christianity. It's a very sort of left-brained kind of Unitarianism with a super high emphasis on reason and science. It's not quite my cup of tea, but it is interesting. He was a strong supporter of Lockean political ideas and religious toleration. He became friends with Benjamin Franklin in the 1760s and a strong supporter of the American Revolution. His home and church were burned by rioters in 1791, and he fled to the United States. He became good friends with Jefferson and Adams, and he strongly strengthened the growth of Unitarianism in the United States with his arrival. Thomas Jefferson, it sort of goes without saying that Jefferson was extremely interested in and influenced by John Locke. The US is basically Jefferson and friends putting John Locke's political philosophy into actual practice and law. Jefferson was himself quite a radical Unitarian, and even to the point of cutting supernatural stories out of the Bible, not something I recommend doing for the record. However, his belief in divine providence and direct divine action in human affairs, I think, is often underappreciated. And the common label of deist, I don't think, is as accurate to Thomas Jefferson's theology as is commonly believed. And in fact, when you read Jefferson's speeches and stuff like that, I often think he has a stronger view of God's action in the world than most Christians do now. But that's not a full endorsement of Jefferson's theology, but he was a Unitarian, and Jefferson was also very aware of Unitarianism, Socinianism, and Michael Servetus, and had all of those books in his own library. Again, Marian Hillar quoting, the ideas of Polish brethren, or the Socinians, were transplanted to the American continent by James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, who implemented them for the first time in American legislation. Both were broadly educated, and Jefferson had a keen interest in studying religions, especially Servetus and the Socinians. Like I said, I think Jefferson's religiosity and curiosity about religion is sort of underrated, and his favorite religious group was the Socinians and Michael Servetus. So John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. So this is John Adams writing to Thomas Jefferson in 1813. If the Unitarian prayers and preaching of our clergy here are not a full demonstration that the Trinitarian folly is fast approaching its end, I know not what can be evidence of a proposition. Thomas Jefferson to John Adams. I trust that there is not a young man now living in the United States who will not die a Unitarian. So their predictions were perhaps a little bit hasty. But if you look at surveys of Americans, Jesus was a great teacher, but he was not God. 53% of Americans agree, only 63% disagree. 51% of regular church attending Americans even agree. So 51% of Americans who attend church regularly agree with the statement Jesus was a great teacher, but he was not God. So all those people who think I'm some weird religious exception, half of American churchgoers agree with me. Over half. Only 47% disagree. Take that into account next time you're viewing me as some weird religious minority. This is according to the State of Theology survey in 2022. There was a survey that came out just a couple days ago as I was preparing this episode. Shocking survey finds only 11% of Americans believe in the Trinity, from Cultural Research Center at Arizona Christian College. So John Adams and Thomas Jefferson might have been slightly overstating the growth of Unitarianism in their day, but America is not as Trinitarian as you might think. All right, Hannah Adams. I hope that many of you have paid attention to this stage. The unsung hero that I want to call attention to in this whole series is Hannah Adams. She was born in 1755 in Medfield, Massachusetts, lived until 1831. She never married, and she seems like sort of a quiet, bookish type person. Her father had gone to Harvard, and their family boarded Harvard students, and she would often help tutor them. So she was the sort of person, women couldn't go to Harvard in those days, but she was smarter than the average Harvard student, and she had been taught by her father, and she helped tutor Harvard students in her own house near Harvard in Medfield, Massachusetts. She also published a lot of books. One of her books, or her first book, or I think it's her first famous book, was A View of Religions, 1784. And it was a first of its kind encyclopedia of religions of the world. And instead of giving sort of biased or derogatory descriptions, it gave fair and attempting to be accurate descriptions of all the different religions and religious movements of the world. And this was sort of a bestseller, especially in New England. If you were a well-educated, upstanding New England person, you had this encyclopedia on your bookshelf. She also wrote a summary history of New England, also a bestseller. And most importantly, for our purposes, she wrote a history of the Jews. She is often considered the first woman in history to make her own living as an author. She was John Adams's third cousin. She is also my third cousin, 8 generations removed. So her and I are not very genetically related. That's a pretty distant relationship, but I could draw a family tree that showed how that she was in fact my distant relative. And my third daughter, who's now almost 3 years old, I named my daughter Hannah Adams Tiedemann in honor of this Hannah Adams. She was a good friend and maintained close ties with John Adams, the second president, and John Adams read all of her books. She also published a Letters on the Gospels, which is also a fascinating thing to read, which was supposedly just for the education of her nieces, is what it says in the preface. But it's actually a shockingly good book that uses her strong knowledge of Judaism to help better explain the Gospels from a Jewish perspective and with a Jewish contextual lens. Again, this idea that you should use Judaism to better understand the origins of Christianity was still not a popular idea at this time. Like I said, Servetus had said similar things, and Hannah Adams used her own study of Judaism to write something like a commentary on the Gospels with sort of her Jewish knowledge helping illuminate various facts and stuff going on. Let's see here. But her going back to her book, A History of the Jews, it told the story of the Jews from the destruction of the temple up until her day. And most Christians, especially Americans, where there were very few Jews, did not know very much about the Jews, or at least what had happened to them after the events of the Bible. And she corresponded with multiple Jews while doing her research. And her perspective was very sympathetic and positive, and showed the Jews as a resilient and admirable people, and pushed back against many negative stereotypes. Let's see here. After removing so this is from her autobiography. After removing to Boston and residing in that city while the disputes upon Unitarian sentiments were warmly agitated, I read all that came in my way upon both sides of that question and carefully examined the New Testament with, I think, a sincere and ardent desire to know the truth. I deeply felt the difficulties upon both sides of the question, yet prevailingly give the preference to that class of Unitarians who adopt the highest idea of the greatness and dignity of the Son of God. I have never arrived to that degree of decision that some have attained on that subject. So she says she moved to Boston, and there was huge agitation about the Unitarian question that was going on at that time, and that she studied this topic with deep seriousness and came to be persuaded by the Unitarians. Specifically, she says the class of Unitarians who had the highest sense of dignity and greatness of the Son of God. So she probably would not have liked the Thomas Jefferson or the Joseph Priestley style of Unitarianism, but instead the kind of more traditional, or you might say biblical, Unitarian side, because she was examining the New Testament. Although she does say she never came to as high a degree of certainty on that subject as some people have. So she had a little bit of doubt and a little bit of sympathy, maybe you could say, for the Trinitarian argument, but most of her intellectual agreement was with the Unitarians. I think Hannah Adams had an extremely large and underappreciated effect on positive American attitudes towards Jews. Like I said, her books were very big sellers and very well read by at least the educated New England class at that time. And this positive portrayal of the Jews and this positive attitude towards the Jews in her works, I think, was very influential. I even have some suspicion that her research on the history of the Jews might have helped give rise to dispensationalist ideas about the return of the Jews to their homeland as a fulfillment of prophecy. All right, now I'm going to turn to the second president of the United States, John Adams, and Hannah Adams's third cousin. John Adams is also my, I think, third cousin, 8 times removed or something like that. So not a super close relative, but a relative. Uh, how is it possible that Voltaire should represent the Hebrews in such a contemptible light? They are the most glorious nation that ever inhabited the earth. The Romans and their empire were but a bauble in comparison to the Jews. They have given religion to 3/4 of the globe and have influenced the affairs of mankind more and more happily than any other nation, ancient or modern. And John Adams, I think, is getting these sentiments very directly from his relative Hannah Adams. And this idea that the Jews have benefited mankind more than any other nation, ancient or modern, and that they're more important than the Romans. Very pro Jewish sentiments indeed. And that was not entirely a common thing at the time. And he's criticizing Voltaire's anti Semitism. All right. This is a letter John Adams wrote to Mordecai Noah, an American Jew. He wrote it in March 15th, 1819. I could find it in my heart to wish that you had been at the head of 100,000 Israelites and marching with them into Judea and making a conquest of that country and restoring your nation to the dominion of it. For I really wish the Jews again in Judea an independent nation. I believe once restored to an independent government and no longer persecuted, the Jews would soon wear away some of their asperities and peculiarities of their character, and possibly in time become liberal Unitarian Christians. For your Jehovah is our Jehovah. Your God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is our God. A remarkable thing in many ways. This is the first time that an American president will recommend the Jews return to their homeland and have a nation in their homeland of their own. And I can't imagine that very many other political leaders at the time were saying such a thing. And that this connection of American pro-Jewish sentiment and the sort of New England educated classes appreciation of Jewish history, which again I largely attribute to Hannah Adams. And although he does admit the asperities and peculiarities of their character, I have to say, since some of my best friends are Jewish, that Jews still do have some peculiarities of character, but I love them for it. And he is hoping that they become liberal Unitarian Christians. I mean, I also hope that they become Unitarian Christians, although maybe not quite as liberal. Although liberal meant something very different back then than it does now. But I'll just say I do hope that Jews become Unitarian Christians. But again, this idea that The Unitarian conception of God and the Jewish conception of God are one and the same, which is something very different than what, say, Gregory of Nyssa or Athanasius or Justinian the emperor would say. And that's very connected to John Adams's Unitarianism. All right, so Unitarians heart Judaism. Christian Unitarianism and Judaism have a long relationship, and it's often a much more positive relationship than any other kind of Christianity. The shared belief in the oneness of God causes a sense of kinship. Unitarians mostly view our roots in Judaism favorably. Christian Unitarianism has often been derided as too similar to Judaism by Trinitarianism. Unitarians can relate to some, but not all, of the weird feelings of being persecuted by a religion that is supposedly similar to you. Because of the shared history of persecution, Unitarianism often seeks a political situation tolerable for religious minorities and individual conscience and truth seeking. Unitarianism, often because it is still technically Christian, is often better suited at grabbing the reins of power, although it often does so only briefly, within Christian societies than Judaism is. But every time Unitarianism has done so, it tends to create an extremely favorable climate for Judaism as well. So I want to close by returning to that greatest and most influential of Unitarian Christian philosophers, the Apostle Paul of Tarsus, and his writings from Romans 11. I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means. For I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Do you not know what the scripture says of Elijah, how he appeals to God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets, they have demolished your altars, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. But what is God's reply to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So too, at the present time, is there a remnant chosen by grace. What then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking? The elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened. So I ask, did they stumble in order that they might fall? By no means. Rather, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles, so as to make Israel jealous. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? And again, I think that idea is pretty similar to what Jesus was saying in that parable of the tenants, that the current tenants of the vineyard, because of their failure to do what the owner of the vineyard had asked, they get kicked out of their vineyard, and the vineyard is given to, sorry, there was an ant on my webcam, and the vineyard is given to a different people. So Paul here, I don't think is saying anything that Jesus didn't predict. So this idea that Paul is so different than Jesus I just don't see it. I think that Paul is saying the exact same things that Jesus was already predicting. Um, if the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches. If you are, remember it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. And those Christians who are running around saying Christ is king as a anti-Jewish taunt, I think are very guilty of what Paul here is condemning. We Christians must not forget that it is the root that supports us. Then you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. That is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief, but you stand fast through faith. So do not become proud, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. And even they, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in. For God has the power to graft them in again. For if you were cut from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, the natural branches, be grafted back into their own olive tree? Again, you still have this very Judeo-centric view in Paul that it is Judaism, which is this sort of cultivated olive tree, and all these Gentiles are wild, uncultivated, uncivilized olive trees, but they're being grafted in. Lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come to Zion. He will banish ungodliness from Jacob, and this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. As regards the gospel, they are enemies for your sake, but as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers. For the gift and the calling of God are irrevocable. For just as you were at one time disobedient to God, but have now received mercy because of their disobedience, so they too have now been disobedient, in order that by the mercy shown to you, they also may now receive mercy. For God has consigned all to disobedience, that he may have mercy on all. Oh, the depths of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable are his judgments, and how inscrutable his ways! For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen. John 19:19 through 22. Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. The chief priests of the Jews protested to Pilate, do not write the King of the Jews, but that this man only claimed to be the King of the Jews. Pilate answered, what I have written, I have written. And it said, Jesus Nazareth, Jesus Nazarenus Rex Eudorum, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, also in Aramaic and Greek. And so, I don't know. I think it's important for us Christians to remember that we are a wild olive branch grafted in. We are dogs eating the crumbs of the master's table. And while there has been somewhat of a switcheroo where the Jews have been cast out from their previous status and Christians have taken their place, that this is not the final state of things. I don't know how all of this will come together. I don't know exactly what to make of this role of Unitarianism in sort of helping keep the Jews around and alive and giving them safe quarters to live in, whether it be the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth or the United States, or the strong support of the reestablishment of the state of Israel going all the way back to the sentiments of John Adams. But I just want to say to my Jewish friends that while I do see rising anti-Semitism among many Christian groups at the moment, and I find it as alarming and distasteful and worrisome as the rest of us, that for whatever it's worth, we Unitarians are with you, and we share the same God. We share the same conception of that God. And I don't know what role each of us has to play in God's plans to come, but all Christians should view their relationship to God with gratitude and fear and a remembering that we are not the root, but we are supported by the root, and that root is Judaism. So thank you all for listening. I came in under 2 hours this time. Catch you all next time.